The Verk Dominion announced the war on a Tuesday morning, station time, which happened to be the same Tuesday morning that Ambassador Raina Voss was eating cold tamales from a foil pouch and reading a 3-month-old crossword puzzle on her tablet. The notification came through the diplomatic channel with all the ceremony of a spam filter alert. She finished the tamale. She read the message again. Then she set the tablet face down on the table, picked up her coffee, and looked out the viewport at the curved sweep of the conclave ring, all its kilometer-long pylons draped in the running lights of 40 civilizations. And she thought about her grandmother, who used to say that the worst news always arrived while you were eating. The message was 12 words in Vari Standard, and they translated cleanly. The Dominion declares a state of active reclamation against humanity. It was signed by the Archprime itself, not a subordinate, not a council secretary, but the Archprime, which meant they weren't bluffing, and it meant they'd already committed the fleet. Active reclamation was the Verk legal designation for total absorption. It meant they weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to own. Raina sat with that for a moment. Outside the viewport, the station's running lights moved in their slow perpetual cycle. Amber warning strobes, blue navigation markers, white docking indicators blinking every 12 seconds with the clockwork patience of systems that had never once considered the possibility of an emergency. She had looked at those lights from this exact chair approximately 400 times in 2 years. They had never once made her feel safe. But they had always made her feel steady, that specific feeling that comes from a familiar rhythm, the same way a heartbeat is reassuring not because it's extraordinary, but because it continues. She held on to steady for about 15 seconds. She thought about the 11 species in the Verk archives, all of them preserved, all of them finished. She thought about the mission brief she'd been handed 2 years ago, the one that said first contact maintenance, routine, and how she'd read it 3 times and decided whoever wrote it had never met a Verk. She thought about her grandmother's door and the advice about letting trouble in. Then she started working. She sent one reply before she did anything else. It went to the Archprime's direct channel, flagged priority diplomatic, and it said, acknowledged. Query: does the Dominion's operational timeline permit a brief window for formal farewell protocols? The Human Diplomatic Corps has customs regarding closure. Estimated duration, 90 standard minutes. She got a response in 4 minutes. The Archprime was nothing if not punctual. It said, granted, 90 minutes. Then the reclamation begins. She typed back, thank you, we'll be ready. Then she called her staff together in the briefing room. There were 6 of them. Her deputy, a thin man named Pieter who chewed his thumbnail when he was nervous and was chewing it now down to the quick. Her cultural liaison, Dara, who had spent 8 years studying Verk biology and spoke their secondary dialect without an accent. 2 junior attachés whose names Raina always remembered as a pair, Sanchez and Ewan, because they were never apart. Her communications officer, a heavy-set woman named Bev who had once cried at a Verk aria because she said the frequency resonance hit something in her chest she couldn't explain. And finally, sitting at the far end of the table with his arms folded, and his expression arranged into the specific blankness of a man who had already decided not to panic, her security advisor, Marcus Webb. She told them what the message said. The room was quiet for about 4 seconds. Sanchez made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Ewan put his hands flat on the table. 90 minutes, Pieter said. That's right. And then the fleet moves. Raina sat down. Which is why we're not going to spend those 90 minutes panicking. We're going to spend them working. Marcus unfolded his arms. The station's defense grid. Won't stop a Dominion battle fleet, and you know it. She looked at him evenly. What the grid can do, if we're clever about it, is buy us time. Time has always been the only currency humanity actually has in surplus. She paused. We have a lot of very smart, very stubborn people in this room. I want ideas, not prayers, ideas. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dara leaned forward. "The Dominion's declaration went through official channels," she said, "which means it's on the Conclave record." "It is." "Which means every other species on this station saw it." "They did." Dara folded her hands. "The Verk don't negotiate, but the Conclave has 39 other members who are now watching a Dominion fleet move toward a station they all share. Some of them have very strong feelings about that sort of precedent." Reyna looked at her for a moment. Then she allowed herself the smallest smile she had worn in weeks. "Get me a line to the Thelian Assembly, and the Murin Cooperative, and anybody else in the outer ring who owes us a favor or owes the Verk a grudge." She stood. "And somebody heat up more tamales. We're going to be here a while." The Verk Dominion had existed for 6,000 years, which by galactic standards made them middle-aged. They had absorbed 11 species in that time. Not destroyed, absorbed. That was the distinction they were very careful about in their official historiography. The absorbed species still existed. They were simply reorganized. Their genetic lines were catalogued. Their cultural expressions were permitted in designated ceremonial contexts, and their cognitive architectures were mapped and preserved in the Dominion's vast archive network. The Verk did not consider this conquest. They considered it conservation. The humans had been watching them for 30 years, since first contact, and in those 30 years the humans had made a study of the Verk the way you study a river when you're not sure whether you're going to have to swim it. They cataloged the fleet configurations. They logged the absorption protocols. They learned the secondary dialect and the tertiary one, and the one that the Verk only used among family, the one that had no grammatical register for asking permission. They watched 11 species get conserved, and they felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Something older than either, the feeling of a people who had been underestimated before and who had developed, across centuries of being underestimated, a very specific set of skills that only became visible when someone pushed hard enough. Ambassador Reyna Voss had been pushing for 2 years to get a better table at the Conclave. She had spent that time making friends and making debts, and mapping every fracture in every alliance on the station, with the patience of someone who understood that you did not win wars with weapons. You won them with timing. She had never told anyone she was preparing for this. She had never said the word war out loud in any official briefing. But in her private logs, in the cramped shorthand she'd been keeping since she was a cadet, she had written the same phrase at the bottom of every entry for 2 years running: make them miscalculate. She believed that was how humans won, not by being stronger, not by being smarter, by being stranger than anyone expected, and by being willing to sit in the discomfort of the strange while their adversary tried to process it. The arch-prime of the Verk Dominion was a creature called Vor-7. It had held the position for 400 standard years, which was not unusual. The Verk lived long, and Vor-7 had the additional advantage of being genuinely brilliant, the kind of brilliant that looked like certainty from a distance and like arrogance from up close. It had personally overseen the absorption of 3 species. It understood military dynamics the way a musician understands chord structure, not as a series of rules to follow, but as a natural language with natural resolutions. You apply pressure here, the system resolves there. Simple. It had not expected the reply it received from the human ambassador at the 90-minute mark. The message read, "Ambassador Reyna Voss of the Human Diplomatic Accord formally acknowledges the Verk Dominion's declaration. Before the reclamation proceeds, the Accord invokes Article 7 of the Conclave Charter, requesting a formal hearing before the full Assembly. As per Article 7, the requesting party is entitled to present its case before all registered members. The Dominion, as a Conclave signatory, is bound by this provision. Estimated duration of hearing, 6 to 8 standard hours." The Archprime read this 3 times, then it called its legal counsel. The legal counsel confirmed what the Archprime already suspected. Article 7 was valid. The Dominion had signed the Conclave Charter 400 years ago, at a time when the Conclave had 12 members, and the Charter had been mostly ceremonial. Article 7 had never been invoked in 400 years by anyone, because no species facing Verk reclamation had ever had the standing to invoke it. You needed full Conclave membership for Article 7, and the species the Dominion absorbed were never full members. They were minor civilizations on the periphery, without political standing in the body, without allies, without 400 years of diplomatic relationship building that had quietly, patiently, positioned humanity at the exact fulcrum of the Conclave's political balance of power. The Archprime sent its reply. The Dominion recognizes the Article 7 invocation. The hearing is granted. Reyna received the message, read it once, and put it face down on the table next to the empty foil pouch from the tamales. She looked at Peter. 6 hours, he said. He had stopped chewing his thumbnail. His voice had changed, not calmer exactly, but more focused. The way a person's voice changes when they stop being afraid of a thing and start being serious about it. 6 hours, she agreed, and I know exactly what I'm going to say. The assembly chamber of the conclave ring was built to accommodate the biology of 40 species, which meant it was enormous, climate-segmented, variably pressurized, lit in 7 different spectra simultaneously, and always smelled faintly of something no human could quite identify. Reyna had been in it 60 times. She had never spoken from the primary floor before. The primary floor was reserved for full sessions, for the kind of moment that got logged in the conclave's official record with a timestamp and an archivist's note. She walked in wearing the standard-issue navy jacket of the Human Diplomatic Accord, which she had pressed herself in her quarters that morning because the station's dry-cleaning service had been on maintenance for a week. Her collar pin was the small silver one she'd gotten from her mother when she made ambassador, a human figure, arms open, the classic diplomatic gesture. She did not wear anything formal. She did not wear a uniform. She wore the navy jacket, and she carried a single data chip, and she walked to the speaking position in the exact center of the floor like she owned it. The chamber was full. Every species in the conclave had sent representation, most of them in person. The Verk delegation sat in their section, a high-humidity enclave along the northern wall, and Reyna could see Vorsethen itself, huge and still, its bioluminescent nodes cycling slowly through the deep blues that indicated watchfulness. Around the chamber, other species rustled and adjusted and communicated in their own registers. Some of them Reyna could read, the Thelians, whose body language she'd studied for years, were projecting what she interpreted as cautious interest. The Murren were harder to read, but their senior diplomat had caught her eye when she walked in, and had performed the small forward lean that meant, in Murren protocol, I am listening. Reyna stood at the speaking position and let the chamber settle. The last time she had been nervous before a speech was 8 years ago, her first major address to the conclave's trade subcommittee. She'd prepared for 3 weeks. She'd memorized every word. She'd stood at the speaking position and opened her mouth and said the first prepared sentence, and then a Thelian delegate had dropped something metallic on the floor, and the clang had knocked everything out of her head, and she'd stood there for what felt like a year but was probably 2 seconds, and then she'd said something completely different from anything she'd prepared. Something true. Something she'd actually been thinking for months without ever saying. The speech she'd given that day was the best one she'd ever given. She'd never prepared a speech the same way again. Then she said, in Vari standard with no notes, I want to tell you something about where I come from. The translation matrix hummed. 40 species received the words in 40 registers. Humans have a thing we call a story, she said. It's older than writing. It's older than cities. It's the thing we do when we need to understand something. We put it in a shape. We give it a beginning and a middle and an end, and we say, here is what happened, and here is what it means, and here is what we carry forward. We've been doing it for as long as there have been humans around a fire. She paused. The Verk Dominion has absorbed 11 civilizations. I've read all 11 records. They're in the Dominion's archive, beautifully preserved, catalogued with extraordinary precision. Everything each species was, down to the molecular level. Another pause. But I noticed something. The stories aren't there. The archives have genetic samples and cognitive maps and cultural indexes. They don't have stories. They don't have the shape of things. She looked directly at Vorsethen. That's not an oversight. Stories can't be archived. Stories only exist when someone tells them and someone hears them and something passes between the two. You can catalog a species. You cannot catalog what it means to be one. The chamber was very quiet. I'm not here to argue military capability, Raina said. I'm not going to tell you that humanity would survive a Verk reclamation, because we might not, and I don't make arguments I can't defend. What I'm going to tell you is this. She looked around the chamber slowly. 40 species are watching a Dominion fleet move toward a station you all share. 40 species are now holding in their memory the fact that Article 7 was invocable, that it had always been invocable, and that it was a human who invoked it. 40 species are asking themselves, right now, if they came for humans, who do they come for next? She let that land. I'm not threatening the Dominion. I am making an observation that is true regardless of what this chamber decides. The Verk have always been precise. They know what a precedent costs. She put the data chip on the speaking surface and stepped back one step. On that chip is a proposal. Not a surrender, not a concession, a proposal. Joint Human-Verk administration of 3 frontier sectors that the Dominion has identified for reclamation. Shared resource access. Human cultural and governance autonomy preserved in full. And in exchange, the thing the Dominion has never had in 6,000 years of absorbing civilizations. She looked at Vorsethen again. A species that chose to work with you, not one that was conserved, one that agreed. I think that's worth more than a catalog, but I'll leave that to the Archprime to determine. She picked up the chip, walked to the Verk section, and placed it on the interface ledge in front of Vorsethen. Then she walked back to her seat. The chamber erupted. Not in applause. The species in the chamber had 20 different registers for approval, and most of them weren't audible to human ears. But Raina could feel it, the shift in the room, the way the pressure changed when something that had been leaning one way suddenly found a new center of gravity. The Thelian delegation was doing something with its secondary limbs that Dara had once described to Raina as the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Murran senior diplomat had leaned forward past the diplomatic midpoint, all the way into what Murran protocol classified as personal space, which meant what she'd said had gotten inside their armor. In the Verk section, no one moved. The Dominion's delegation was composed and still in the way of things that have spent 6,000 years not needing to react to anything quickly. But Raina had been watching that section from the corner of her eye since she'd walked in, and she saw the moment, very small, almost invisible, when the secondary advisor to Vorsethen turned its head 3 degrees toward the Archprime. In human body language it would have meant, "Are you seeing this?" In Verk body language, it meant something adjacent and equally revealing. She saw it and she filed it, and she kept her expression where it was. Vorsethen didn't move for a long time. The bioluminescent node cycled from deep blue into something Raina had never seen before, a slow amber pulse that started at the center of its torso and moved outward like a tide. She looked at Dara. Dara's eyes were wide. She leaned in and said very quietly, "That's the color they use for reconsidering." The Archprime of the Verk Dominion had not reconsidered anything in 400 years. Raina looked at the data chip sitting on the interface ledge. "Good," she said, "good." But the hearing was not the end of it. The hearing was the beginning of the middle, which in Raina's experience was the hardest part, the part where the initial shock wore off and people started looking for reasons it wouldn't work. The Dominion's military advisors pushed back hard. They argued that the proposal was a delay tactic. They argued that human autonomy in the joint sectors would create administrative complications. They argued, with some justification, that no species had ever successfully negotiated a partnership arrangement with the Dominion, and that there was no historical model for what Reyna was proposing. Reyna's response to every argument was the same. You're right, and that's exactly the point. You have 6,000 years of models, she told the Dominion's chief legal advisor during one of the 17 formal subsessions that followed the main hearing. Every one of those models ends with the same outcome. I'm not offering you a model. I'm offering you an experiment. You're a civilization that values precision and preservation. You have never once in 6,000 years conducted an experiment to see if there's a better method. That's not precision. That's habit. The legal advisor was a creature called Subvoice Renathal, significantly smaller than the Archprime, with a regimented carapace that indicated high administrative rank and the slightly too still quality of someone very used to being the most dangerous mind in a room. It regarded Reyna for what felt like a full minute. The ambassador is aware, it said, that the Dominion does not make decisions based on philosophical appeal. The ambassador is aware, Reyna said, that the Dominion just spent 16 hours in a conclave hearing it did not expect to attend. Something has already changed. Renathal was still for another long moment, then it said, continue. Renathal filed a report to Vorsethen that evening. The report, which Reyna would not see until much later when the Dominion opened its negotiation archives under the Joint Administration Protocols, noted that the human ambassador was engaging in non-standard logical approaches that do not resolve under standard Dominion legal analysis frameworks. It recommended continued engagement. It also noted, in what passed in Verk administrative language for an editorial aside, that the humans' rhetorical techniques were unlike anything the legal council had encountered in 400 years of Dominion service, and that this was worth paying attention to. Reyna didn't know about the report. She was eating a very cold tamale in the corridor outside the subsession room and talking to Marcus, who had produced from somewhere a thermos of coffee that was still warm and was possibly the single most valuable object on the station at that moment. "How's it looking?" Marcus asked. "Hard to say. Renathal is brilliant, probably the most precise mind I've sat across from. It keeps trying to find the formal logical resolution to everything I say, and I keep giving it things that don't have formal logical resolutions." She bit into the tamale. "I think that's working. I think. It's hard to read." "You think it's working, or you know it's working?" "I think I know it's working," she considered. "That's different from knowing. But it's the best I've got." Marcus looked at her for a moment. He had the quality, which Reyna valued enormously, of not filling silence with words. He said what needed saying and then stopped, which meant when he spoke you listened. "The fleet is still in approach formation," he said. "I know. The station's defense grid. Can't stop them, I know, Marcus." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to stop the fleet. I'm trying to make the fleet irrelevant. Those are different objectives." He looked at her for another moment. Then he handed her the thermos. "The coffee's better than the tamale." "Everything is better than the tamale," she poured. "Thank you." She went back into the subsession. The subsessions ran for 3 more days. Reyna slept 4 hours a night and ate whatever her staff put in front of her and drank enough coffee to keep a mid-sized ship running on backup power. Her team was extraordinary. She already knew that, had known it for years, but watching them work in those 3 days was something else. Pieter drafted 6 versions of the administrative framework before breakfast on day 2, and the 6th one was genuinely brilliant. Dara caught 3 translation errors in the Verk legal language that would have closed off entire avenues of negotiation, and fixed them in a way that didn't embarrass the Dominion's translators. Sanchez and Ewan ran continuous analysis on the political temperature of the conclave chamber, feeding Reyna real-time updates on which of the 40 species were shifting towards support and which were staying neutral, and what each shift required in response. Bev, improbably, composed a short piece of music in the Verk ceremonial frequency range and played it through the communications system on day 3, not as a diplomatic gesture, she said, just because she'd been thinking about that aria for a week, and the frequencies were already in her head. Ren Athel had stopped in the middle of a sentence when the music started. No one commented on it, but the session after the music was the smoothest of all the sessions. There was a moment on the second day when the sub-session had stalled badly, a 3-hour deadlock over the resource allocation framework for the outer Ven sector, a genuine impasse where both delegations had said everything they had to say and were now sitting across from each other in the particular silence of people who have run out of words before they've run out of problems. Reyna had looked at her team. Pieter had that expression he got when he was restructuring a problem from the ground up, slow and interior. Dara was very still in the way that meant she was working in the secondary Verk dialect in her head, translating concepts rather than words. Sanchez had a stylus in his hand and was drawing something on a notepad with the focused attention of a person who was either doodling absent-mindedly or was 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Reyna had said, "Let's take 20 minutes." The delegations had separated. In the corridor outside, Reyna had looked at Sanchez's notepad. He'd drawn a 3-tier resource flow diagram, not the one in the treaty draft, a different one, with a node structure that neither the human nor the Verk model used, but that incorporated elements of both in a way that resolved the specific conflict they'd been stuck on. "When did you?" Reyna started. While Ren Athel was making the counterargument about subsection 12, Sanchez said, "The problem isn't the allocation numbers. It's the reporting hierarchy, if we flip it." "Show me." He showed her. Ewan, who had been standing slightly back with his arms folded, said, "The Verk will have a problem with the horizontal reporting structure. Their administrative model is vertical." "Yes," Sanchez said, "but if we frame it as a parallel track rather than a hierarchy." "They might not notice they've accepted a horizontal structure," Dara said, not unkindly. "That's either clever or it's going to cause trouble in 6 months." "I'd rather have the trouble in 6 months than the impasse now," Reyna said. "Let's take it back in." They'd taken it back in. Ren Athel had studied the diagram for 4 minutes, which was a long time, for the legal counsel, and then had said, carefully, "The parallel track structure is unusual." A pause. "But not inconsistent with Dominion administrative law as applied to novel administrative categories." "Which was Verk for, we accept this." They'd moved past the impasse in 20 minutes. Marcus Webb spent the 3 days not sleeping and not smiling and being very visibly present at every door. He had, Reyna learned on day 2, quietly coordinated with station security to position 3 human military vessels at the station's outer approach markers, not weapons hot, not threateningly, just present, just visible on the Dominion fleet's sensors, a reminder that the conversation had not yet concluded. When she asked him about it, he said, "I didn't come to watch you negotiate a funeral." She looked at him for a moment. Was that a compliment? It was a security posture. She went back to the sub-session. On the 4th day, Vorsethen itself entered the negotiating room. It was the first time the Archprime had been present in a session below the assembly level. This was, Dara told her before the session, unprecedented. The Verk did not descend. The Archprime received. This was, Dara searched for a diplomatic term and then gave up and used the honest one. This was enormous. Reyna had been told 15 minutes before the session that the Archprime was coming. She had spent 12 of those 15 minutes reviewing the treaty draft, not because she needed to review it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Pieter had stood in the doorway looking at her, and she'd said, without looking up, "Don't say anything." He hadn't said anything. He'd gotten her a cup of coffee instead, which was the right call. The remaining 3 minutes she'd spent alone in the small anteroom off the negotiating chamber, standing in front of the narrow reflective panel they used for video calls. She'd looked at herself for a moment, the navy jacket, the collar pin, the particular expression she wore when she was about to do something that mattered, and thought, "Grandmother, I wish you could see this." And then she'd thought, "No, actually, you tell me to stop making faces at mirrors and go do the thing." And she'd gone to do the thing. Vor7 settled into the Verk delegation section of the negotiating room and arranged itself in the formal attentiveness posture. It said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. The bioluminescent nodes were cycling amber and something new, a slow, deep green that Dara identified, with some uncertainty, as the color associated with long-term calculation. The ambassador told the assembly a story, Vor7 said, in Vari Standard, addressing Reyna directly. "About stories." "I did. The Dominion's archives are the most comprehensive in the known galaxy. The preservation of absorbed species is total. This is not cataloging." It paused and the nodes shifted. "But the ambassador's observation cannot be dismissed. The shape of a thing is not the thing." Reyna kept her face neutral. She had learned years ago that the moments that felt like victories were often still very dangerous. "We have reviewed the proposal," Vor7 said. "The joint administration of the 3 frontier sectors is structurally feasible. The human governance provisions are unusual but not incompatible with Dominion administrative law." Another pause. "What the Dominion requires in exchange for proceeding is not a concession. It is a demonstration." "Of what?" "That the humans understand what they are agreeing to." The amber nodes deepened. "You are proposing to work alongside us. To function within a structure we have built over 6,000 years. You understand that structure will not bend to accommodate human customs." "I understand," Reyna said. "I'm also going to tell you something honestly, Arch Prime, because I think we've been honest enough in this room for one more honest thing." She looked directly at the Arch Prime's primary visual array. "The structure won't need to bend. Humans are the most adaptable species in this quadrant. That's not arrogance. It's the thing that kept us alive when we had no technology worth naming and a planet that was trying to kill us in 6 different ways simultaneously. We adapt. We change shape to fit the container. But when we change shape, we do not lose what we are. And I think that is exactly what the Dominion has never had in its 6,000 years. A species that can work inside your structure and still remain itself." She paused. "That is not a threat. That is the value I'm offering you." Vor7 was quiet for a very long time. The room was very still. Pieter had stopped chewing his thumbnail. Dara had her hands folded in her lap. Bev was looking at a point in the middle distance with the particular concentration of someone listening to something no one else can hear. Then Vor7 said, "The Archprime is willing to proceed to formal treaty drafting." The sentence was quiet. It was 12 words. It was the most significant thing Reyna had heard in 11 years of diplomatic work, and she heard it the way you hear a structural change in a storm. Not as a sound, but as a shift in pressure, the whole world reorganizing around a new center. She said, "Thank you, Arch Prime." Vor7 said, "Do not thank us yet. Drafting will be difficult." "I know." "The humans have a saying," Vor7 said. "We have studied your linguistic records. You say, the devil is in the details." Reyna blinked. Then she laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine, not a diplomatic laugh. "We do say that. The Dominion says, the details are where civilizations are built or broken." The amber nodes pulsed. "We will build carefully." "We will," Reyna said. "And Arch Prime, for what it's worth, I think that's a better version of the saying." The treaty drafting took 6 weeks. Reyna barely left the station during those 6 weeks. She called her sister on the 2nd day to say she was alive and busy, called her mother on the 7th day to say the same thing, and spoke to no one outside the negotiating team except in official capacity. She ate cold tamales from foil pouches and drank too much coffee and slept badly and kept waking up in the early station hours with the specific alertness of a person whose subconscious is still working on a problem she hasn't solved yet. The problems were real. The administrative language for the joint sectors took 11 days and 4 complete rewrites to get right, because the Verk concept of administrative authority was genuinely different from the human one in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The Dominion didn't have a clean separation between governing and owning, and the human governance provisions required building a new conceptual category inside Verk legal language that had never needed to exist before. Ren Athel turned out to be, under the formidable carapace, a genuinely excellent legal mind, rigorous and creative in ways the Verk rarely showed to species they were about to absorb, but apparently willing to show to a species they were about to partner with. The legal advisor and Pieter became, across 6 weeks of arguing about administrative frameworks at close range, something that might have been the precursor to professional respect. The cultural provisions were harder, not because the Verk were resistant, they weren't. After the initial sessions, Vorsethen had apparently communicated something to its delegation that shifted the temperature in the room on day 3 of drafting in a way Raina couldn't quite identify, but because the humans kept finding new things to protect. Not physical things. Raina wasn't worried about the physical. She was worried about the things that lived inside people, the way families organized themselves, the stories they told their children, the small rituals that accumulated over generations into something that looked from the outside like custom, but felt from the inside like survival. The mirror the old woman had in her kitchen and looked into every morning before the world got its hands on her for the day. The nursery rhymes sung at specific times with specific inflections that carried specific weights. The meals that weren't about nutrition, the songs that weren't about the words. These were the things the Dominion's archives had never held, and these were the things Raina fought for, line by line, across 6 weeks of drafting. She had a moment, late on day 5 of the cultural provisions work, when she was alone in the briefing room with the draft treaty and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. It was station night, the running lights dimmed to their sleep cycle, and the chamber was quiet in a way that the station was rarely quiet, that deep, slightly pressurized quiet that came when all 40 species had finally stopped actively communicating and were doing whatever they did when they weren't communicating. Sleeping, maybe. Running maintenance cycles, sitting in whatever they called darkness and waiting for morning. Raina had been looking at a clause for 90 minutes. The clause was about the transmission of knowledge, specifically, knowledge that had no fixed form, that existed only in the passing of it from one person to another. The Verk's legal language had 6 terms for knowledge. None of them covered what the clause was trying to protect. She had been trying to build the term out of available materials for 90 minutes, and none of her constructions were right. She put down the pen. She looked at the cold coffee. She thought about a specific afternoon in her mother's kitchen, age 11, her grandmother's voice coming through the old wall speaker because her grandmother lived 2,000 kilometers away and they called every Sunday. Her grandmother was explaining how to do something, make the masa, season the meat, which order the layers went in, and her mother was writing it down and getting it slightly wrong, and her grandmother was correcting her with the patient, specific patience of someone who understood that the written version was never entirely right. That the right version lived in the hands, that you had to be in the room, that you had to watch. Raina had not thought about that afternoon in years. She picked up the pen. She built the clause differently, not from the Verk's 6 terms for knowledge, but from the Verk term for presence, for being in the room. The clause now read, in its legal translation, the transmission of forms whose existence is contingent upon active, witnessed passing between living members of the species, the form that requires the room. Ren Athel the next morning read the clause twice. Then it said, "This is structurally unusual." "Yes," Raina said. "It protects forms that cannot be indexed." "Yes." The Dominion's archive system cannot store forms that cannot be indexed. I know, Reyna said. That's exactly what I'm protecting. Another long pause. Renathel's carapace shifted a small movement, almost imperceptible. The ambassador is protecting things we cannot take. I'm protecting things that can only exist if people are free to pass them on, Reyna said. Which amounts to the same thing. Dara was indispensable. She sat across from the Verk cultural liaisons, creatures called voice shapers, 6 of them, extraordinarily perceptive, and she argued for 2 days about a single clause regarding the transmission of oral tradition. The voice shapers kept trying to resolve the clause into something measurable, something the archive could index. Dara kept pushing back. Oral tradition was not the words, it was the breath between the words, it was the pause before the punchline. It was the moment the grandmother decided to tell the story with the funny ending instead of the sad one because she could read the room. You couldn't archive the breath. You could only protect the space where the breath could happen. On day 4 of the oral tradition argument, Bev walked into the meeting room with a recording she'd made on her personal device and played it without asking permission. It was her grandmother's voice. Her actual grandmother, 93 years old, video called from Earth the previous evening, singing a song in a language that wasn't Spanish or English but something older, a regional dialect from a place that had become a town that had become a memory. Bev's grandmother didn't know she was being recorded. She was just singing because she'd been asked if she remembered the song. The voice shapers were silent for a very long time after the recording ended. Then the senior one said, in careful Vari standard, "The sound is not in the archive." "No," Dara said. "It's not. It cannot be replicated." "No. When the woman dies." "Then it goes," Bev said. Her voice was steady. "Unless she teaches someone, unless the someone teaches someone else. That's the whole mechanism. That's what we're trying to protect, not the song, the mechanism." The clause was rewritten that afternoon and passed without further objection. Reyna added a note to her private log that evening. "Bev saved the oral tradition provision today. Not how I expected it to happen. Note to self, the path through is rarely the one you plan for. The path through is almost always the one that comes from the thing you weren't supposed to bring into the meeting." She sat for a moment with that. She thought about the comic book in the old stories, the cursed one, the stolen one, the one that was just a book until someone opened it and found out it was a door. She thought about the Verk archives, everything catalogued, everything preserved, everything dead. She thought about the fact that the Dominion was 6,000 years old and had never once had a species push back in a way that surprised it. She thought about how long it takes to develop the specific and peculiar skill of making yourself incomprehensible to something that thinks it already understands you. She thought about her grandmother, who used to leave the front door unlocked because she said trouble always came in anyway, and there was no sense letting it scratch the paint. About the way her grandmother had of looking at a situation that should have been terrible and saying, in that flat voice that meant she'd already decided, well, then she'd fix it, or she'd outlast it, or she'd do the thing that nobody else had thought of because nobody else had been paying attention in the way she'd been paying attention. Reyna had spent her whole career trying to be that kind of person. She thought maybe she was getting there. 6 weeks after the drafting began, the treaty was complete. 47 pages in Vari Standard, 11 appendices, a cultural framework protocol, and 3 sector-specific administrative structures that Renathel said, with what might have been respect, were the most creative legal constructions the Dominion had encountered in its modern era. The signing was scheduled for the first day of the conclave's formal session period in the assembly chamber before all 40 member species. Reyna wore the navy jacket again, the same one, freshly pressed, her collar pin, the small silver ambassador's figure with its arms open. Vorsethen arrived in the chamber first, which was again unprecedented. The Archprime always arrived last, to all formal occasions, the position of supreme authority receiving rather than waiting. When Reyna walked into the chamber and saw the Archprime already at the signing table, she stopped for just a moment. The amber nodes were cycling, and the green, and something new, a warm, deep red that she'd never seen in the documentation and didn't have a translation for. She walked to the table and sat down across from Vorsethen. "Archprime," she said. "Ambassador," Vorsethen said. They looked at each other. Around them, the chamber was settling into attentiveness, 40 species arranged in their biological sections, the whole vast wheel of the conclave ring holding its breath or its equivalent. "I want to ask you something," Reyna said quietly, just between the two of them before the formal session began. "What did you think when I sent that first reply, the one about the farewell protocols?" The bioluminescent nodes pulsed in a slow, complex pattern. "I thought," Vorsethen said, "that no species facing reclamation had ever asked us for time before. They asked for mercy. They asked for exceptions. They bargained with resources or military threats. You asked for time. Another pulse. Time is the one thing we have always been certain we possessed in infinite quantity. It was unexpected. And unexpected is uncomfortable for a civilization that prides itself on precision," Vorsethen said, "and occasionally illuminating." Reyna looked at the treaty on the table between them. 47 pages, 11 appendices, the first partnership agreement in 6,000 years of Dominion history. "My grandmother used to say," she said, "that the strangest things get through the door when you're not watching for them." The Archprime was quiet for a moment, a wise woman. She was. She also said the worst news always arrives while you're eating. A sound came from Vorsethen that the translation matrix rendered as an unclassified vocalization without standard equivalent. Reyna had spent 11 years learning to read alien emotion in every register available to her. She was fairly certain the sound was laughter. She wasn't completely certain. She was certain enough. The formal session convened. The treaty was read into the conclave record by the secretary archivist, in Vari Standard, and then in 12 secondary languages, and then in the Verk's own primary register. Every species present received the full text and the full translation. The conclave's historical record would note, for any future species that consulted it, that on this date a species that had existed for approximately 300,000 years and had reached the stars approximately 300 years ago had negotiated a partnership with a civilization 6,000 years its senior that had never partnered with anyone. The record would also note that the negotiation had begun because a human diplomat had asked, before anything else, whether she could have 90 minutes. Reyna signed her name in the human script, which was looping and inconsistent, and looked, she'd been told, like organized chaos. Vorsethen applied the Dominion's formal seal, which was precise and ancient and looked like something carved out of absolute certainty. Pieter, standing behind her, exhaled for what sounded like the first time in 6 weeks. Reyna capped the pen. She looked at the signed page. She thought, "My grandmother would have something to say about this, and I would tell her about it someday if the call times weren't so brutal at this distance, and she would probably just say, 'Well then,' in that flat voice, and then she'd fix the tamales she'd definitely been making while I was talking because she did everything at the same time, that woman. She never sat still for anything, and I have spent my whole life trying to live up to that." She thought, this is not the end. The joint sectors would be difficult. The administrative structures would generate disputes, probably daily for the first few years, and some of them would be serious, and some of them would be genuinely dangerous, and all of them would require the kind of attention and stubbornness and creativity that had gotten her to this table in the first place. The Dominion did not change shape easily. Neither did humanity. Two things that didn't change shape easily, trying to share space, that was going to be interesting. But interesting was okay. Interesting was what you worked with. She thought about the Verk archives, 6,000 years of civilizations, all of them catalogued with extraordinary care, all of them dead in the specific way that things are dead when they are preserved but not continued. The Dominion had spent 6,000 years thinking preservation was the same as existence. They had kept everything and lost the one thing you couldn't keep, the ongoing, irreducible, chaotic, argumentative, grief-soaked, stubborn act of a people continuing to be themselves. You couldn't archive that. You could only leave room for it. That was what the treaty did. 47 pages and 11 appendices, and the core of it, the thing that everything else was built around, was room. Room for humanity to remain itself within a structure it had agreed to share. Room for the Werk to have, for the first time in 6,000 years, a species that hadn't been conserved but had chosen. Room for the thing that lived in the space between people when they were actually, genuinely trying to understand each other. The Archprime's bioluminescent nodes were still cycling in that warm, deep red, and Raina looked at it and let herself hold the question. What did it mean? She didn't know yet. She would find out. She would add it to the documentation, build the word for it if one didn't exist, because that was the thing about humans. They named things obsessively, and they couldn't stop, and they'd been doing it since before they had writing, since they were sitting around fires making sounds that turned into words that turned into stories that turned into 6,000 years of being complicated and alive. She would start with the color. She would ask Dara. She would ask the voice shapers. She would ask and she would listen, and she would make it into a story that both of them could carry, because that was the mechanism. Not the thing, but the mechanism, the breath between the words, the space where the meaning lived. The session was called to close. The conclave's secretary archivist pronounced the treaty formally entered into the record. Around the chamber, 40 species made 40 different sounds, and some of them were audible to human ears and some weren't, and all of them meant more or less the same thing. Raina sat very still in the middle of it, the way her grandmother used to sit very still sometimes. Not from calm, but from the specific alertness of a person who knows that this moment, exactly this one, is worth holding long enough to remember. Afterward, the Thelian Assembly wanted a word, and the Murran Cooperative wanted a word, and 3 species Raina had barely spoken to in 2 years wanted words, and she gave each of them the attention they deserved, which was real attention, not diplomatic attention, because the treaty was only the beginning, and the next 6 months of relationship building on this station would determine whether it held. She was in conversations until station night fell and the lights shifted to the amber of the slow cycle, and she was still talking when Marcus Webb appeared at her side and said, in the voice he used when he was telling her something was non-negotiable, "You need to sleep." "I need. You've been awake for 22 hours. You signed the first human-Werk partnership treaty in 6,000 years of galactic history. Sleep." She looked at him. He looked back. This was a man who had, she had learned over 2 years, approximately 3 facial expressions: neutral, alert, and the specific configuration of someone who has already won an argument and is simply waiting for the other party to realize it. He was currently wearing the 3rd one. "Fine," she said. "One more conversation." "Ma'am." "The Keth delegation. 5 minutes. They have a subsector adjacent to the outer Ven, and I want to know if they've been approached by the Dominion." Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. He walked her to the Keth section, stood outside for 5 minutes, walked her out when she emerged, and guided her, with the precision of someone managing a piece of complex equipment, back to her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the viewport, the station lights, the slow sweep of the running cycle. She pulled out her private log and wrote, "Treaty signed. Day 1 of everything else starts tomorrow. Note to self, ask Dara about the red color. Also, find out what the Keth have been offered and by whom. Also, call Mom." She put the log away. She looked at the viewport for another minute. She fell asleep sitting up, still in the navy jacket, the collar pin catching the light from outside. In the morning, Peter brought coffee, and a fresh foil pouch of tamales. Apparently there was a supply depot 3 levels down that he had discovered in week 4 of drafting, and had been quietly stocking since then. And Raina ate the tamale, and drank the coffee and read through the first stack of post-treaty administrative queries. 17 of them, from Dominion sector administrators who had already begun the process of establishing joint oversight structures. The queries were written in the precise, formal Werk administrative style, numbered, cross-referenced, no ambiguity permitted. They were also, she noticed, written with more care than the standard Dominion communication. The language was slightly adjusted, slightly more transparent, as though the writers were aware they were communicating with someone who had a different conceptual framework and were, awkwardly but genuinely, trying to bridge it. She wrote back to each of them. She used Vari standard and kept her replies precise and clear and warm in exactly the degree that the Werk communications were not warm, because she had decided early in the drafting process that the humans were not going to match the Dominion's register. They were going to be themselves, consistently and without apology, and eventually the Dominion would have a catalog of how that worked, and it would stop being strange and start being, she hoped, reliable. Reliability was worth something. Reliability was the first thing you built. Bev knocked on the door while Raina was on the 12th reply. She had a look on her face that Raina recognized as the look of someone about to say something that was going to cost her something to say. "What?" Raina said. Vorsethen's voice shapers sent a communication. Not official, it came through the personal channel, the one we use for informal cross-cultural exchange. Bev paused. "They want to know if you'd be willing to have a session, not about the treaty, about human music. They want to hear more." Raina put down her pen. She looked at Bev for a moment. "Because of the recording. Because of the recording." Raina thought about Bev's grandmother, 93 years old, singing in that dialect that wasn't quite Spanish, not knowing anyone was listening except her granddaughter who had asked if she remembered the song. She thought about the voice shapers falling silent when the recording ended. She thought about what Dara had said. You can't archive the breath. You can only protect the space where the breath can happen. "Tell them yes," Raina said, "next week, and ask them if they'd be willing to share something in exchange, something they consider not official, not archive material, something they sing or whatever the equivalent is." She paused. "Tell them informal exchange only. No documentation, no catalog entry, just being in the room." Bev's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough. "You think they'll agree?" "I think they already know they want to," Raina said. "They just needed someone to say it was allowed." Bev went to send the message. Raina went back to the administrative queries. Query 13 was about subsection 4 of Appendix 9, regarding the oversight schedule for resource extraction in the outer Venn sector's secondary mineral deposits, and it was going to take a careful answer, because the subsection had 3 interpretable clauses, and the Dominion administrator had clearly interpreted all 3 in the most restrictive possible direction, and was going to need to be gently redirected without losing face. She wrote the reply. She was halfway through when her tablet chimed with a notification from Ren Athel. The legal counsel had reviewed the first round of sector administrative reports and wished to schedule a working session to align interpretive frameworks for Appendix 7. She sent back, agreed, Thursday 900 station time, bring coffee. "We have a lot to align." There was a pause of about 90 seconds. Then Ren Athel replied, "The Dominion does not consume the stimulant beverage. However, the legal counsel has noted that its presence in the room correlates positively with human processing efficiency. Coffee will be provided." Raina stared at that message for a moment. Then she wrote, "Thank you. That's the most Werk thing anyone has ever said to me, and I mean that as a compliment." Another pause. Then, the legal counsel accepts the characterization. She put the tablet down and looked at the viewport. Outside, the station lights were in their morning cycle, the full-spectrum white of the active hours, all 40 civilizations running lights going at once, the conclave ring looking from the outside like a thrown handful of stars. She had been looking at it for 2 years, and it had never once looked the same twice, because the composition changed constantly, ships arriving and departing, alliances shifting, 40 living things negotiating their proximity on a structure that had been built for exactly that purpose. She picked the tablet back up. There were still 5 queries to answer. Then she called her mother. Her mother picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. She was sitting in the kitchen in the house where Raina had grown up, and the light behind her was the particular afternoon gold of a home that had held the same family for 3 generations. And she was looking at Raina with the expression of a woman who had been watching the news feeds for 6 weeks and had not once said, "I'm worried." "Mija," her mother said. "Hi, Mom. You look terrible." "I know. Is it over?" "The first part is over," Raina said. "The second part starts now." Her mother looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother called last night. She said she saw something on the feeds about a treaty." "She did." She said. Her mother paused, and the small smile at the corners of her mouth was the one that meant she was quoting directly. She said, "Well then." Raina laughed. It was the real laugh, short and surprised, the same one she'd laughed in the conclave chamber when Vorsethan had quoted the human saying about the devil. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly right. She also said to tell you to eat something, not whatever you've been eating." "Tell her I'll try." Her mother looked at her for another moment, the gold light behind her, the kitchen that smelled of everything that had ever been cooked in it. "Come home when you can," she said. "I will. I know you will." A pause. "We're proud of you." Raina looked at her mother's face on the screen, the specific pride in it that wasn't about the treaty or the conclave or the 6,000 years of Verk history, but was about something smaller and more durable. The fact of her daughter, still in the fight, still eating bad tamales from foil pouches, still calling when she said she would call. "Thanks, Mom," she said. "I'll talk to you soon." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her quarters, the amber morning light outside, the station turning in its slow rotation. Then Marcus Webb appeared at her door. He had a talent for this, the precisely timed appearance. She had stopped questioning it and said, "The Thelian Assembly would like a word." And Raina said, "Tell them I'll be right there." And she stood up, and she straightened her jacket, and she walked toward the next thing. Outside the viewport, at the edge of the station's sensor range, the Verk fleet was still there. It would be there for a while. Fleet deployments took time to unwind, and the Dominion moved at its own pace. But the formation had changed. The ships that had been positioned in approach configuration had shifted to something the military analysts, looking at the data later, would classify as standard escort posture. Raina didn't see the formation change. She was in the Thelian section by then, listening to the Assembly's senior diplomat with her full attention, nodding at the right moments, storing information she would need later. But Marcus Webb saw it. He was watching the sensor feed on his wrist display because he always watched the sensor feed, because that was his job, because someone had to keep their eyes on the part of the picture that wasn't inside the room. He looked at the display for a moment. He looked at the formation change. He looked at the data tag that identified the posture shift. He didn't say anything. He wasn't the kind of person who said things out loud when he didn't have to. But he put his wrist down and he looked at the door Raina had just walked through, and he let himself have, for exactly 1 second, the expression of a person who has been sitting with a held breath for 6 weeks and has just, very quietly, let it out. Then he went back to watching. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, station time, Raina Voss was eating cold tamales from a foil pouch and writing a report on the first month of Joint Sector Administration, when a notification came through the diplomatic channel. She picked up the tablet. The notification was from Ren Athel, and it was flagged routine, and it was a request for clarification on a specific subsection of Appendix 4 regarding resource-sharing protocols in the outer Ven sector. She read it twice. She ate another tamale. She composed her reply with the particular care she gave to things that looked routine and weren't, because the routine things were where structures got built or broken, and she had not come this far to break something over a subsection. When she was done, she sent the reply, put the tablet down, and looked out the viewport at the conclave ring, all its lights running in all their frequencies, all its species doing whatever they were doing in all their biology on this average Tuesday morning. She thought, this is the work. This specific thing right now is the work. She picked up the tablet again and started on the next message.